In this video, I'll be talking about comparative and contrastive linguistics. So essentially, contrastive linguistics is about saying what is different between languages and linguistic varieties. So, for example, contrastive linguistics would be comparing American English and British English, or Australian English, or Mexican Spanish versus Spanish from Spain or Spanish from Argentina. That would be examples of comparing linguistic varieties, right? Or we could also be comparing languages. So for example, when we compare Italian to French, or Korean to Japanese or something, right? And in contrastive linguistics, what we're looking for are differences. Yeah, we want to find the aspects which are not the same in both languages, or not similar. And in comparative linguistics, we want to say what's the same between different languages, or at least very similar. So, for example, if we think about, I don't know, information and información, yeah, quite similar now. So those kind of comparatives, those comparisons are what we're looking for. And we could find what's the same between, I don't know, Mexican Spanish and Peruvian Spanish, or Paraguayan Spanish and Spanish from Costa Rica, right? So we're looking for these similarities. Yeah, they don't have to be exactly the same. Or we could also look at the similarities between Swahili and Zulu. So comparative, looking for things that are the same, and contrastive, looking for things that are different. Okay, so let's talk about cognates, and more importantly, perhaps, false cognates. So when we think about a word or a pair of words like actualmente and actually, that's an example of false cognates because they look similar, but they're not, they don't actually have the same meaning. So they have the same origin, they come from the same word, and they come from the same original word, but they mean different things. So actualmente means like right now, currently, nowadays, and actually means de hecho. Now, a second one that I've included is eventualmente and eventually, because this is a very interesting case, because this is beginning to change in Spanish, because in English, eventualmente, or eventually, I'm sorry, means finally, in the end, ¿no? Al final. And eventually he sent me the letter. Y por fin me mandó la carta. I eventually found the solution. Y por fin encontré la solución. Now, originally in Spanish, eventualmente meant, or still means, de vez en cuando. Yeah, for example, if you have un trabajo eventual, yeah, you work now and then. You work when you're called, when you work when you're asked, right? So if you said, tengo un trabajo eventual, por ende, yo trabajo eventualmente, then that would be the original usage of that word. Now, that meaning is actually beginning to change. For example, you will hear people in Spanish say things like, eventualmente las llantas se desgastan. Yeah? Eventualmente los puertos de las computadoras se desgastan con el uso. Yeah? And in a more traditional sense, that would be finalmente se empiezan a gastar. They no se gastan like from time to time. Yeah? What they mean, like finalmente se desgastan, right? So the reason why that is beginning to change is actually because of influence from English. Because English means eventually means finalmente. The meaning of eventualmente is starting to change away from de vez en cuando towards finalmente. Okay, so pretty interesting case. And then we have other cases where we have complete cognates: información, information; música, music. No? They come from the same root, they have the same etymological base, but they and they mean the same thing. Whereas these false cognates have the same etymological root, they come from the same base, they come from the same word originally, but because of a process of semantic change, they now mean different things in different languages. Okay, because the way Spanish has developed and the way English has developed are different. Okay, good. So we have these differences, right? Okay, so we've established that there are differences between different languages. Now the question becomes why? Why do we have differences? Well, one of the main reasons is because of geographical separation. So, for example, if you have one community who lives on one side of a river and another community who lives on the other side of the river, and they don't really have much contact. Let's say there's not a bridge between both communities. They don't have much contact. Then the way they speak on one side of the river takes one direction. It takes its own path. It develops in its own way. And the people on the other side of the river, their language also develops in their own way. And because they don't really have much contact, there's a lack of contact. Each linguistic variety takes its own path. And then they can become, very, very different, because, languages are constantly changing, and therefore each variety becomes different over time. Okay, but we also have similarities, right? So then the question is, well, why do we have these similarities? And the reasons for those could be, well, because they have a common origin, right? So if we think about languages such as Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Catalan, French as well, they all basically come from Latin. I mean, of course, there are influences from other languages. So, I mean, if we think about ojalá coming from Arabic, inshallah, or if we think about selfie, quiero tomar un selfie, that come, obviously La RAE wants us to say una autofoto, but nobody that I know says that. So, of course, in these cases, you get influences. So, you obviously, when one language influences another, then you can get kind of aspects of that language, and that makes the two linguistic varieties more and more similar. So let's talk about this concept of superstrate and substrate. So the superstrate language usually influences the substrate language more. So the superstrate language or linguistic variety is usually the powerful language, the language that's associated with money and political influence and good jobs and blah, blah. So in the case of the USA and Mexico, the superstrate in this case is the USA and therefore English or American English. And the substrate in this case is Mexican Spanish. So therefore, Mexican Spanish has American English has a much bigger influence on Mexican Spanish than Mexican Spanish has on American English. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't influence it. Of course, if you go to the south of the United States, there are lots of kind of Spanish words, Spanish street names, etc., etc. But in English, in Spanish, we've incorporated lots of words like fashion, outfit, lipstick, selfie, and the list goes on. And also in the world of technology, software, hardware, etc. These words didn't exist in Spanish, and they're not originally Spanish words. So because of the tech giants in the USA, for example, Apple, Google, Amazon, blah, 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 because they're creating these new words, internet, for example, these words are just linguistic borrowings, and they're coming from the superstrate American English into the substrate Mexican Spanish. Now, of course, this process can happen in reverse, but it's not quite so common. The arrow from here to here is bigger than the arrow from here to here in terms of influence. So there's some of the reasons why we have similarities and differences between languages, and and that's the focus of contrastive linguistics, is to look at differences, and comparative linguistics is to look at similarities. Okay, well, as always, guys, I hope this information was useful.